Sing like no one's listening. Love like you've never been hurt. Dance like nobody's watching. And live like it's heaven on earth.
Balla come se nessuno ti stesse guardando. Canta come se nessuno ti stesse ascoltando. Ama come se nessuno ti avesse mai fatto soffrire. Vivi come se un paradiso fosse sulla terra. Balla come se nessuno ti stesse guardando. Canta come se nessuno ti stesse ascoltando. Ama come se nessuno ti avesse mai fatto soffrire. Vivi come se un paradiso fosse sulla terra. Balla canta, vivi, come se nessuno ti stesse ascoltando. Ama come se nessuno ti avesse mai fatto soffrire. Vivi come se un paradiso fosse sulla terra.
Hello and welcome everyone to A Future Without Nuclear Weapons. My name is Olivia. I'm part of the ICOT organising committee. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you so much to Tanya de Jong, who provided the beautiful music that you just listened to. If you would like to hear more of Tanya's music, you can head to tanyadejong.com. She will also be a speaker at ICOT 2021, which is being held here in Melbourne in July. Before I hand over to our speakers today, I will just be quickly going through the housekeeping notes. Just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available for on-demand viewing within the next 24 hours. And the recording will be available for 72 hours, which means you'll have until Monday, the 10th of May at 5 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time to watch this recording. This webinar will just last under an hour, including our Q&A. To ask your questions today, in the left-hand menu, you'll notice there is the Ask a Question tab. You can do two things in this tab. You can ask a question, or you can upvote questions, which means that these questions will be pushed through to our speakers above other questions. All participants will be muted and your videos will not be visible. This is to allow the speakers to present uninterrupted today. The little box that you are watching this stream in, you have either chosen to watch it full view or you may have a small pip on your screen. If you click the top bar on this screen, you will be able to move it around your screen for your own viewing, or you can click the bottom right-hand corner to drag and make the screen whichever size you would like. Without any further ado though, I would like to introduce our first speaker of today, who will be introducing our panel and what we will be discussing. Tim Wright, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Olivia and the rest of the ICOT team. And thank you to all who have joined us today for this pre-conference webinar. As Olivia said, the topic of the webinar is a future without nuclear weapons. But I hope that there are lessons from today's webinar that have broader relevance for anyone who's interested in ways to bring about change, and particularly ways to shape international norms. ICOT, of course, is a conference about thinking, and much of our work at ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, is about changing the way that people think about nuclear weapons. We ourselves, of course, aren't out there dismantling nuclear bombs. That's what governments have to do. But I think that we have been successful to some degree in changing, shifting public opinion and influencing decision makers. And so that's what we'll be discussing today. The nuclear armed states, of which there are 9, have been quite successful also in presenting their narratives of nuclear weapons and using those narratives to justify the continued existence of nuclear arsenals. And often they use very abstract concepts, deterrence theory and strategic stability and so on, which really obscure the horrific reality of what these weapons are and what they do to people and the environment. And so our approach to nuclear weapons is about cutting through those official narratives, challenging those narratives, and exposing the reality of the weapons. And that's what we'll be unpacking with you today. Before we begin our discussion, I want to start with a quote from Albert Einstein, which I think is very pertinent to this webinar. And he said, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe." As you might be aware, Einstein supported the early efforts in the United States to develop nuclear weapons, but later became a pacifist and expressed regret at having played that role. And he said, "If only I had known, I should have become a watchmaker." The three of us who will be speaking today very much believe that our modes of thinking can change and must change, and that we can avert the nuclear catastrophe that Einstein warned of. And I've had the pleasure of working for the past 15 years or so with Fred Mendelsohn and Dimity Hawkins in ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. We were all involved in setting up the campaign in 2007. This is a campaign that was founded here in Melbourne and is now active in more than 100 countries. And we worked for several years to convince governments of the need for a treaty that outlaws nuclear weapons. And that treaty was adopted at the UN in 2017 with the support of 122 countries. And it entered into force just a few months ago at the beginning of this year. So let me now introduce one of the panelists, Professor Fred Mendelsohn, who's a renowned neuroscientist, but he's also been very outspoken for many years against nuclear weapons. He served as the director of the Howard Florey Institute at the University of Melbourne. And before establishing ICAN, he was involved in the organization called the Medical Association for Prevention of War, and its international federation, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And so, Fred, I want to ask you, first of all, why it is that doctors and scientists have shown such a strong interest in this issue and have been so vocal in their opposition to nuclear weapons, really since the dawn of the atomic age in 1945.
Thank you, Tim. I guess I should start by congratulating ICAN, all the people who've worked on this with a fantastic outcome. Tim has rightly pointed out the horrible effects of nuclear weapons in killing large numbers of people immediately and then going on killing by radiation effects. And now we've come to learn by effects on climate and food production. So these weapons, which are still on the globe in huge numbers, something like 14,000, are a threat to our ongoing existence and many other species as well. Climate change and pandemics have captured public concern quite rightly, but nuclear weapons are still up there. They're equal in their capacity to wreak most terrible havoc. So I think ever since the bombing of Hiroshima, it was obvious that these weapons induced the most terrible injuries and that there is no medical response. There's nothing doctors can do. There were 298 doctors on Hiroshima when the bomb dropped, and then 252 were dead. There were no clinics, there were no hospitals, there was no first aid, there was no Red Cross. So faced with that, medicine says treat by all means if you possibly can, but there is no treatment other than prevention. So I think medical groups have been solidly behind attempts to abolish nuclear weapons right from the start. Scientists are a bit different. You heard that Einstein wrote to President Roosevelt, I think it was, and urged him to develop the atomic bomb because they'd heard that the Nazis might be doing so. And that is an agonizing decision. And so Einstein was very influential in the bomb being constructed and perhaps not used. And as Tim mentioned, soon after, he regretted that. And a number of scientists involved in the Manhattan Project formed a group called Bulletin of the Concerned Scientists. They put out a bulletin of where they thought the issue was at present. And the closer to midnight, the closer to Armageddon. Most horrifyingly, they've decided that we're in an extremely high risk time and put the clock 100 seconds before midnight. So we are at a time of heightened risk of nuclear war, and we hope desperately that governments will follow their citizens in rejecting this. So I think doctors and scientists have both been right in the centre of this problem, but now I don't think anyone who considers the evidence reasonably can fail to be passionately anti-nuclear.
Yeah, and I think that there's a need really for evidence-based decision making on a whole range of issues, and that is lacking not just in this area but in other areas. Thanks, Fred, for those introductory remarks, and I want to turn now to our other panelist, Dimity Hawkins, another dear colleague, an activist and an academic, a leading expert on nuclear weapons, who was recently made a member of the Order of Australia for her outstanding disarmament work. Dimity, I want to ask you your thoughts on why it is that we need to place people and the effects of nuclear weapons on people at the centre of this debate, and particularly why it's important to include the voices of victims and survivors of nuclear weapons use and testing in disarmament discussions.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, listen, this has been absolutely key to ICAN's work. There's an unfortunate, unwilling pool of expertise in communities now intergenerationally that have borne the brunt of nuclear weapons use and testing across the world. So following the devastating events in Hiroshima and Nagasaki 75 years ago, nearly 76, over 2,000 nuclear weapons tests happened around the world over the next 50 years, and 315 of these happened here in our region, including right here in Australia. So when we began ICAN, we identified the need to centre these experts as a core part of our campaign to achieve our core goals, which were a ban on nukes. That had to be led by a humanitarian process to stigmatise and outlaw and then abolish these weapons. And therefore those survivor stories were integral, and they remain so. In my own experience, it's almost impossible to hear the testimonies of Hibakusha, the atomic bomb survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and not be moved. It's almost impossible to hear the stories and the experiences of people who were exposed to nuclear testing from across the Pacific and here in our own country. Read those long hidden testimonies or speak with the people who had those stories passed down through generations now, and not be moved to act. And spending time, for example, with the Fijian military veterans who speak of watching the mushroom clouds going up over the Christmas Island in Kiribati, and growing up, and the heat, the pain, and over again as they were used in the British nuclear testing programs. Or here in Australia, the thousands of nuclear veterans who have died without recognition or adequate care by either our government or by the British. So Indigenous people here in Australia too have borne the brunt of the testing programs, and they've been rendered invisible, and they're dispossessed from their lands. They had their traditional food and water sources held back from them, their travel routes, their freedom. And they were ignored for the testimonies for way too long, but not anymore. So it's hard to hear all of these stories, but it becomes harder still not to act when you do hear those stories. At the moment, like Fred and you have said, Tim, there's tens of thousands of nuclear weapons in the world, I think 14,000, 13,000. At least 1,800 of these are on hair trigger alert, and they're able to be launched within minutes. So any further use of these weapons would mean that we will see more victims and more survivors who for generations will have to live with the consequences. So we keep those victims and survivors at the center of this work also because we're cognizant that we may find ourselves as one of those victims or survivors just at the press of a button. That's how real the threat is still today.
Yeah, thank you, Dimity, for reminding us that when we talk about victims of nuclear weapons, we're not just talking about the people who were killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and who have suffered there since, but also the people in our more immediate region in Australia who have suffered the effects of nuclear testing. And we've certainly as a campaign, work to amplify their voices. Fred, I just want to kind of go back to what you were saying about the kind of gravity of the threat of nuclear weapons. And I mean, do you feel that when we present a lot of the information, a lot of the statistics, that it's just so overwhelming to some people, that and they kind of tune out, and there's a degree of psychic numbing, I suppose you might say. I mean, what in your experience have been the most effective techniques for engaging people with this issue? Do you find that the kind of very rational arguments tend to be most effective, or emotional arguments? And I also want to ask you about how it is that the decision makers in the nuclear armed states kind of accept this reality and become a part of the system of supporting nuclear weapons. What is it that makes them kind of block out the fact that what they're doing is supporting weapons that are designed to destroy entire cities? How do they find that morally acceptable?
Yeah, well, thank you, Tim. I think that they're very pertinent issues you brought up. I think there's a very real risk that as we talk about these horrors, that people turn off. And I think there's a reality of the human brain is that people just can't digest 100,000 deaths, but they'll be deeply moved by one car accident that they saw. But I think through ICAN's process, I think one of the master strokes was involving the Hibakusha, the survivors of the nuclear weapons. There are many recordings of Setsuko Thurlow, of her experiences and memories. That you can find them on the web. But she spoke at the Oslo Nobel Award ceremony. And she just told us in a plain voice that on the 6th of August, she was at school. They saw a blue flash outside the window. There was silence, and then she awoke to find herself covered in rubble. And with the encouragement of another survivor, she was able to get out from under the rubble. And what they saw was utter desolation, buildings flattened, dead people, and survivors with terrible burns, skins hanging off them, blindness, and so on, shocking injuries. And when she described that as first-person experience, just as Tim said, you could see the tears rolling down the audience and the people on the stage. So I think that to reduce these potential back to human scale is absolutely essential. I think there are a number of other factors which have made ICAN successful where others have failed. And it's 75 years since the usage of the bomb that governments have failed to act. We've had the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but at its most recent meetings, there was no progress whatsoever. And we became alarmed by the lack of progress, and that led to setting up ICAN. Now, your second point, sorry, Tim, was effectiveness. Why haven't our leaders heeded this facts? Well, I think it's because whether we like it or not, we're much more persuaded by fashion and herd instinct than by rational this analysis. And that's the great power of science, that it brought the rational process into our thinking. But if you look, history tells us that the most preposterous ideas and actions have been carried out by groups, each reinforcing each other internally, that these horrible things they were doing were reasonable. So we have a double problem, but I think there's not the slightest doubt we're winning. 79% of people interviewed think that their government should be supporting signing the Prohibition Treaty. It's really a very optimistic time. Here in Australia, our government is not supporting the treaty, which is a terrible thing, because Australia has a proud record of supporting a number of anti-nuclear activities, as well as supporting other indiscriminate weapons, such as landmines, cluster weapons, biological warfare, chemical warfare. And we are working to get nuclear weapons recognised as in that same class of utterly unacceptable weapons.
Thanks, Fred. And I just want to follow on from that. And you mentioned earlier the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was the treaty negotiated in the 1960s. And the big difference between that treaty and the treaty that was adopted in 2017 is that the new treaty says that these weapons are very clearly unacceptable for all states. And I think there's been this idea for many decades that, or at least promoted by the certain nuclear armed states, that they are the responsible ones, they can be trusted with these weapons, and that we just need to make sure that North Korea doesn't get them, or that Iran doesn't get them, and everything will be fine. It's all really a matter of perception, isn't it? Whether what we think of a particular country and its leadership. A lot of people who thought that the United States was very stable and would make rational decisions around these issues were horrified when Trump was elected president and acted very erratically. And I think we need to move beyond thinking about which countries have them and simply accept that the weapons are illegitimate and prohibited for everyone. We need to turn now or soon to the discussion, but I want to throw one final question at Dimity, and that is about how ICAN has worked, and obviously there are groups that have been campaigning for nuclear disarmament really since 1945, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What is it, aside from the focus on the humanitarian harm of nuclear weapons, how is it that ICAN has worked differently? What new techniques and approaches have we really brought to the issue?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Look, a lot of new techniques and approaches, I suppose, in some ways. But we also began really recognizing that we stood on the shoulders of generations of activists and efforts before us as well. And even our logo demonstrates that. Our logo incorporates the CND peace sign of the 1950s with a broken missile reminiscent of a well-known art piece from the 1980s. We're very cognizant of the fact that there's been a whole lot of people who have been making these efforts over time. But at the time that we began, we were really facing years of deadlock in the established disarmament forum and UN bodies and those sorts of things. And as you talk about, there's these abstractions of nuclear weapons diplomacy had allowed a sort of disconnect, a cognitive dissonance to pervade in the international relations for decades and across a lot of the different disarmament mechanisms that we did have. So we saw an imperative to get these conversations back out there, really engaging from the grassroots up, to get people talking and thinking and expecting change on this issue of nuclear weapons. All other weapons of mass destruction had been outlawed, as Fred said, but not nukes. And we were calling on, we'd been called into war in Iraq, for example, on a supposed nuclear weapons programs. But those wars that we went into were led by allied nations who had the largest nuclear weapons arsenals. This kind of, confusing kind of way that it was being seen and played out internationally. There are no safe hands for nuclear weapons, as you were saying, Tim. So in our estimation, the situation could only be countered by a kind of radical disruption. And so how we address nations who carried no nuclear weapons and sought a solution that engaged the majority of the world, because the majority of the world don't have these weapons. So the humanitarian process that we engaged in spearheaded things, towards a people-centered approach. And that's why I think this campaign has worked, because we kept that focus of agendas, on those people, and in particular on the communities that were affected, as we've talked about already. But we also sought out the expertise of medical and scientific minds, legal and diplomats, military, political strategists, but also everyday people who are concerned about the threat that these weapons pose to us. And we began with some really simple messaging principles, like the idea of engaging with horror, definitely, because these weapons are horrific, but also humor and hope and humanity. So across all of these things, the most important part of that was our engagement in a humanitarian process that looked at what would happen if these weapons were used again. We know what would happen because we've seen them used so many times. So it was a process of really sort of shifting those narratives, challenging some of those established norms in the international community to really ask those deep questions about, how are these weapons even allowed to continue, and how should we sort of go about eliminating them? And it was very clear very early on that it was about stigmatizing the very idea of using these weapons and then banning them completely. I think that's a summary. It's a lot more than that, I suppose. It's been a very big process, but I think that's kind of my summary of it.
That was very well said, Dimity, and a good way to wrap up this conversation before we move to the question and answer session. As Olivia said at the beginning, feel free to type in your question. There's a tab that says "Ask a Question," so type it in there, and I hope we've already got some coming in. Before we turn to the questions, we're going to do a poll, and the poll should appear on your screen shortly. There are two questions that we're asking. One is whether you agree that the threat of nuclear weapons in the world is increasing. Yes, no, not sure. Fred has spoken a little bit about the different factors that have led some experts to conclude that the threat is increasing. Of course, the threat has been very high in the past as well. And then the second question is, do you agree that Australia should join the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? I think it should be very clear that the three of us all strongly believe so, but we're eager to hear what you think about that. As Fred and Dimity said, Australia is not yet a party, but there's quite significant political support from the Labor Party, the crossbenchers. In fact, 88 politicians have signed the ICAN pledge so far. So we're going to the results we'll share at the end of the Q&A, but I'll turn now to Olivia, and Olivia will read out the questions that we've had come in.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, I can read out those questions for you. So our first one today: what inspires you to keep working on this issue when there are so many obstacles to eliminating nuclear weapons?
Okay, who wants to? I might have a go at answering that, if you don't mind, Fred and Dimity. And please add your what inspires you as well. For me, I mean, it's the people around me who I'm working with really that keep me inspired. But I think that having little successes and celebrating all of those little successes along the way is what keeps me motivated. And when you reflect on where you began and where we are now, I do see that we are making progress in many ways. So, for example, every politician who signs this pledge that I mentioned, every city that joins our city's appeal, all of these are little victories that are contributing to the progress towards a nuclear weapon-free world. And of course, every time a country signs the treaty or ratifies the treaty, this is a moment of celebration, even if these countries have always rejected nuclear weapons. To formalize that and to have their parliaments approve it and go through that process is really something to celebrate. And this is how we create new international norms. It doesn't just happen immediately. It happens over time with all of these small victories along the way. So that's what keeps me motivated and inspired. And of course, hearing from survivors is also a real source of motivation to ensure that this never happens to anyone else in the world. Did you want to add anything, Dimity and Fred?
Yes.
Oh, you go ahead,
Dimity.
Fred.
I think I became aware, particularly from two books were very influential in my mind. One was a book called The Fate of the Earth, written by Jonathan Schell, in which he pointed out the way we were going. And the other book was by Arthur Koestler called, last book he wrote, called Janus, in which he was looking forward and looking back. And he really said that the testing of the first atomic bomb in the desert of Mexico, New Mexico, was a turning point in human existence. And if we couldn't get rid of those, there was really no future. So I began to realize that if I could focus down my microscope and live in a world of denial, but I thought while I still want to do that, I must put some time into combating this dreadful scourge.
Yeah, lovely. For me, it's a great question about what continues to inspire, because I think many people think it's just such an overwhelming and scary topic that it must be, heartbreaking. And it is often heartbreaking, and it is really hard. But I think one of the things that inspires me is the sense that we are just a part of a continuum. These weapons that were created 75 years ago, nearly 76, have unleashed such harm in the community that we will be living with this for generations to come. And unfortunately, that's the reality of it. But we will be part of something that will have to keep going for a long time to come yet. And so there'll be generations after us who will continue to do this work because of the very nature of these weapons, the waste that they produce, the ways in which they impact on our earth and on our bodies. So we're just part of that. And it sort of feels inspiring to know that we are just a part of something that will have to keep going in not great ways. But the thing that does make it really worthwhile, as Tim said right at the start, is the people that we do this with. To see this global movement, has been such an inspiring thing. And there's people literally in 106 countries around the world who are part of ICAN. But there are people all over the world. It's like a global family. It's a global anti-nuclear family. And it's pretty wonderful to sort of be a part of that and to see the ways that works together and how stories are told all over the world about this very important work and have been for so long now.
Fantastic. Oh, sorry, did you want to say something else?
Dimity's point about the people, I think, is, for me, was critical, because you do have feelings of horror, helplessness, confusion if you just ponder these massive things on your own. But having joined up with groups, and I think hearing Helen Caldecott talk when I was in the United States was enormously influential. That once you start working and rubbing shoulders with people who are doing this work, that in itself is very good therapy for the individual. Of course, it's good therapy for the planet. But,
True.
I have a next question lined up. So a question from the audience. So the threat of nuclear weapon use can de-escalate conflict. Do you have any suggestions for what could replace this deterrent effect if nuclear weapons were to be completely abolished?
Anyone want to take that on?
Tim, you
I
can.
think, our view is certainly that nuclear weapons contribute to tensions among countries and create risks rather than preventing conflict. And the fact that there's a view that the fact that the weapons haven't been used in war since 1945 kind of proves that they're effective in preventing conflict, but a lot of the countries that have the weapons have been involved in conflicts, have been attacked in some cases, and there are just so many instances where these weapons have almost been used, and really the fact that they haven't has come down to luck, and sooner or later our luck will run out, and it's really frightening to read about some of the incidents during the Cold War that have only recently come to light about miscalculations or things like a flock of geese being mistaken as incoming missiles, a weather satellite being launched and that being mistaken as incoming missiles. We came very close during the Cold War, and now we still read about incidents where nuclear weapons have been left behind at a military base or loaded onto the wrong plane, and then suddenly the pilot realizes that he or she has the weapons aboard the plane. Like these are real examples of things that have happened in recent years that really should give us pause and challenge this idea of the weapons providing any kind of stability and safety. But that's what the nuclear armed states want us to believe, that there is a stability, and that this is a delicate balance that they've created. But that's certainly not our opinion. Sorry, Dimity.
I was absolutely agree, of course, but I think that one of the things that I often talk to people about when I'm talking about when people sort of put forward these ideas that nuclear deterrence is a useful theory is, show me a time, show me a situation in which the actual use of these weapons, which are so disproportionate, so indiscriminate, could be justifiably used against another people's anywhere, at any time. Where is that situation going to lead us? What will it do to our world and to the stability of our world if these weapons are used again? The idea of nuclear deterrence, or in Australia's case, the idea of extended nuclear deterrence, is really a myth that we need to challenge. We have to think about better ways beyond that. We have to think about ways to engage that are not going to threaten the whole world with a disproportionate and indiscriminate kind of weapon use that will actually live on through generations and generations. So we need to be much clearer about, the fact that this is not an acceptable kind of threat. Just as any bully in a playground is not acceptable to the broader community in a school ground, then this sort of behavior, this bullying behavior, this threat of great harm, of mass destruction, cannot be acceptable by any state in our global community.
So we just have time for one last question. And I'm going to combination a couple together. So one of our questions actually answers one of the other questions. So what can people here do to bring Australia on board the treaty? As well, I would like to ask, what can we do to help ICAN moving forward?
Just to provide a bit of context, the primary reason for Australia's failure to join the treaty to date is the alliance with the United States, and the United States, as opposed to this treaty, has asked Australia and other allies not to join it, and I think that's the primary reason that the government has adopted for not joining it, even though Australia has adopted a principled position with respect to other unacceptable weapons, even where the United States continues to use and support those weapons, such as cluster munitions and anti-personnel landmines. But practical things that people can do, I mentioned the parliamentary pledge. If your local member of parliament hasn't signed it, please encourage them to do so. Another tool that we have is the cities appeal. We have City of Melbourne, City of Sydney, several towns across Australia that have signed this appeal, and that's calling on the federal government to act. So I'd encourage you to check whether your local council has endorsed that, and if not, urge them to do so. And there are all sorts of other things that you can do to just draw attention to the fact that this treaty exists, the fact that most of the countries in our region support it, that we're a regional outcast, that there's very strong public opinion favouring joining the treaty. Whatever kind of ways whatever outlets that you have available to you, wherever you can influence people, I'd encourage you to mention this treaty, mention this campaign, and that's how we're going to build the movement to get Australia on board.
I would just add that one of the things that we rely on greatly are our benefactors here in Australia, not benefactors, but benefactors who helped us ban the weapons. So if you have the capacity, we encourage people to make donations to the campaign. And across the world, all of those things that Tim mentioned, the cities appeal, the parliamentary appeal, the parliamentary pledge, those are all available all around the world as part of the ICAN campaign. So wherever you're joining us today from around the world, you can access those kinds of things there too.
Fantastic. And I now believe that we can look at the answers to the polling questions. So they will come to your screen shortly. Speakers, you'll be able to see the answers to the polling on your screen as well, I hope.
So for the first question, which was whether the threat of nuclear weapons is increasing in the world, we had 70% say yes, that you think it is, and 30% not sure. So Fred mentioned the bulletin of the atomic scientists and the fact that they believe that we are in a state of heightened risk. The second question, should Australia join the treaty? We've got 90% saying yes and 10% saying not sure. So great to we're certainly very happy to see that no one is saying no. And
That's good.
this is pretty reflective of the actual kind of professionally commissioned opinion polls that we've done, which show very few people are opposed to joining the treaty. Fewer than 10% are opposed, and well over 70% are supportive, with the rest undecided. So I'm glad that we've been convincing. I suppose maybe we didn't need to say anything, and you would have supported it anyway, because I do think that for most people in Australia, it's a pretty instinctive thing to support the abolition of nuclear weapons, and to want to be part of international treaties dealing with these issues. So yeah, very, very pleased to see that result there. And I'm now going to wrap things up, because we're approaching the hour, and to thank you all very much for participating, and we're very much looking forward to the ICOT 2021 conference. I'll be speaking at the conference, so you can, if you're able to attend, I hope you do attend. Then you'll hear more from me about our campaign, and also a whole lot of other wonderful speakers on a wide range of topics. So thank you for joining this pre-conference webinar, and I'd like to hand over now to the conference organizer, Karen, who will say a few final words. Thanks.
You are convincing. The three of you put the human face on this ambitious, enormous campaign, and you have done so much. Thank you very much, Professor Mendelsohn, Tim and Dimity. What you and your ICAN colleagues have done is already in making our world safer, is already helping people realize that they can have a role in this too, that what you have done is so momentous. Who would have believed it would be possible to abolish nuclear weapons in a world where power is taking our world closer to be in such terrible stages, and the desire for power? But what you are doing is making such a difference. What worthy recipients, you and all members of the ICAN team, are to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Congratulations. What you have done and continue to do makes us all winners. Who doesn't want a safer world with a nuclear-free future for us? But hey, even more for our children and the next generations. This all momentous achievement began in Melbourne with an idea. Now, how many people have ideas, and good ideas, but cast them away thinking, oh, too hard, too difficult? But with lots of thinking, talking, sharing, and inviting others, so many different people in different countries, people with different skills, abilities, and experiences, getting together and sharing and collaborating, and not one person saying, oh, it's all about me or all about you, but all together, working together for the greater good. For those who want to read more about how this happened, on the ICAN Australia website, there's an article, how Melbourne activists launched a campaign for nuclear disarmament and won a Nobel Prize. And as we've heard today, and I'll be very quick because I don't want to talk about all the things that we've said now, there's so much to think about, but hey, what we heard is that everything happened has been a people-centered approach, a humanitarian approach. That's been the core. We are all people. We all want a safer, better world. We all can do something to do it, starting with the smallest things. A story with the child, talking about how you've overcome different challenges, but then really looking at the website, the ICAN websites, and thinking, hey, we can take action now. what an honour and privilege it is to listen to you all today, and to know that at ICOT in Melbourne, we're so happy that the three of you will be participating in whatever ways you can. And Tim, accepting this invitation to be a keynote speaker, we thank you all very, very much. And thank Tanya too for the beautiful music today. Music is also a way of bringing peace into our lives in a very different way, but very beautiful. And we have some wonderful, talented musicians at our conference too. And I'll finish there now, but really look forward to joining you all in Melbourne, or however you can join the ICOT, and think about and have questions you may have on what you may have done for in that time, thinking about we can build a safer world together. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you again to Tim, Professor Fred Mendelsohn, Dimity, and for all of you watching as well. I'd just like to wrap up with the outro housekeeping notes. The recording will be made available in the next 24 hours. Any unanswered questions will be sent through to our speakers, and we will send through those answers to yourselves at home. A bit of a telemarketer spiel here. There will be a feedback survey which will come to your screen. We really appreciate your input, as this helps us with all future planning of our webinars. As Karen mentioned, we have some more beautiful music from Tanya de Jong coming up. And also I would just like to remind everyone there is a link in the left-hand side menu if you wish to donate to ICAN. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you all at ICOT 2021.
Des yeux qui font baiser le mien, un rire qui se pèse sur la bouche, voilà le portrait sans retouche. Des